The call came in on a grey Tuesday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the sky over Barry can't decide between rain and the first dirty snow. I was at the kitchen table with a mug going cold and the wood stove ticking as it warmed up, and when the phone lit up with my wife's name, I almost let it ring out. 38 years of marriage teaches you the difference between the calls that matter and the ones that are just her wanting me to pick up bread on the way home. This one had a different weight to it. I could feel it before I answered, the way you feel weather in an old knee. "It's done," she said. "No hello." Her voice was bright in a way I hadn't heard in a long while. Bright and hard, like sun on ice. "The estate cleared this morning. Dad's gone and everything's mine now. The whole thing. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I'm worth millions." I held the mug and looked out the window at the maple in the backyard, mostly bare now, a few stubborn leaves hanging on. "I understand the words," I said. "Good. Then you'll understand this too. I want you out of the house. Take your clothes, take your tools, take whatever you think is yours. I want the cottage cleared out by the weekend because I've already got people interested. I'm done, and you've got nothing to argue with, so don't make it ugly. There's no point." She'd rehearsed it. I could hear that. There were little pauses where she'd practiced the breaths, the spots where she expected me to break in and beg or shout, and when I didn't fill them she kept going, faster, like a car spinning its wheels on a hill. "Which lawyer handles the estate?" I asked. That stopped her for half a second. "Why does that matter?" "It matters to me. Which firm? You don't need to know that. What you need to know is that it's over, and you're not part of it. Pack up. I'll have the papers ready." And then the line went dead, the way it does when someone hangs up hard, trying to make a sound out of it. I sat there a while. The stove ticked. Somewhere down the street a leaf blower started up, that ugly autumn whine, and I thought about how the world just keeps doing its small chores, no matter what gets said into a phone. I did not feel the floor drop out from under me. I want to be honest about that because people expect a man to crumble in that moment, and I didn't. What I felt was something closer to recognition. A thing I'd half known for 2 years had finally said its name out loud, and there's a strange relief in that even when it hurts. I rinsed the mug and set it in the rack. I led the dog out and back in. Then I sat down again and made a list on the back of a hydro bill, the way I've made lists my whole working life, because I spent 41 years as an estimator and then a project manager for a mechanical contractor. And a man in that trade learns one thing above all others: the people who panic lose, and the people who write things down win. Not the loud ones, not the fast ones, the ones who keep the record. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the shape of it. My wife and I married young, both of us from the east end of the city, both of us with parents who'd come over with nothing and worked themselves gray. Her father was the center of her world long before I came along, and he stayed there. He was a sharp man, careful with money in the way of people who remember being poor, and over the decades he built up a tidy little portfolio. The bungalow he and his late wife had lived in, a small 4-unit rental he'd bought in the 70s when nobody wanted it, some bank shares, and the cottage up past Gravenhurst that he'd handed to my wife and me 20 years back so the grandkids would have a lake. He'd had 2 children, my wife and her younger brother, and her brother had moved out to Calgary decades ago for the oil money and rarely called. So in her mind, the estate was always going to be hers. Mostly hers. And she wasn't wrong about the size of it. Toronto area real estate being what it is, the bungalow alone was worth more than her father had earned in his whole life. What she got wrong was simpler and much larger, and it had to do with paper, and with the kind of man her father actually was underneath the gruffness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That first afternoon, I didn't drive over to confront her. I phoned my own lawyer instead. People are sometimes surprised that a tradesman keeps a lawyer on a first-name basis. But when you've spent your career signing contracts and watching jobs go sideways over a single missing clause, you learn the value of one good lawyer the way you learn the value of one good set of winter tires. Mine had drawn up our wills, handled a fender-bender claim once, and reviewed the cottage transfer back when her father did it. I left a message with her assistant, plain and short. My wife says she's inheriting everything. She's told me to leave the house and clear the cottage. She mentioned selling the cottage. I'd like an hour of your time tomorrow. Then I packed a small bag. 2 changes of clothes, my pills, my reading glasses, the binder. The binder is the part that matters. For most of our marriage, I handled the household paper, because she found it tedious and I found it calming, and so I had a fat blue 3-ring binder in the basement filing cabinet with everything in it. The cottage transfer, the deed showing the 2 of us as joint tenants, both names, both signatures, registered against the title up at the land titles office in Bracebridge, the mortgage discharge from when we'd paid it off, the home insurance, and because I'd helped her father with his affairs in his last years when his hands got shaky, copies of a few things he'd asked me to keep safe. I took the whole binder. That night I stayed at a highway motel out by the 400, the kind with a coffee maker bolted to the counter and a heater that rattles. I bought a sandwich and a large double-double at the Tim Hortons attached to the gas station and ate sitting on the edge of the bed with the TV off. My phone buzzed through the evening, texts from her, stacking up the way water stacks behind a clog. You're being childish. Just sign and we can both move on. Dad always said you drag your feet. I'm offering you an easy exit, take it. I didn't answer a single one. I screenshotted each one with the time showing, and I'll tell you why. A record isn't just for proving what happened. It's for keeping yourself honest about what's real when the other person is working hard to make you doubt it. Every time I felt the old guilt rise up, maybe I should just go. Maybe it's easier. Maybe she's right that I've got nothing. I'd look at the deed in the binder with both our names on it, and the panic would settle back down where it belonged. The next morning I met my lawyer in her office on the 2nd floor of a brick building downtown, the radiators clanking, a view of a parking lot and a church. I laid the binder open on her desk and told her the whole thing. Plain, no editorializing. She listened with her pen still, and then she asked me one question that I've thought about many times since. Did your wife's inheritance ever touch the house? I didn't follow at first. She explained, in this province, an inheritance you receive during a marriage is generally yours alone, kept out of the family property calculation, but only if you keep it separate. The moment you pour it into the home the 2 of you share, into the matrimonial home, the protection leaks away, and on top of that, the matrimonial home itself gets special treatment. Neither spouse can sell it or borrow against it without the other one signing. That's the law. It doesn't matter whose name is on the title. The roof you've slept under together belongs, in a real sense, to both of you until a court or an agreement says otherwise. I thought back. 2 summers ago, her father had given her an early gift, a chunk of cash, and she'd insisted we use most of it to redo the kitchen and put a new roof on the house. I'd argued for the cottage instead, and she'd overruled me, and I'd let it go the way you let things go after enough years. She'd put her inheritance straight into the matrimonial home with her own hands. My lawyer didn't smile exactly. She just made a small note. She's standing on ground that isn't there, she said. And the cottage, you're certain you're joint tenants. Both names. Registered. I have the parcel register right here. Then she can't sell it. Not to anyone, not for any price, without your signature on the transfer. If she's told a buyer otherwise, she's told them something that isn't true. She closed her pen. Has she told a buyer otherwise? I said I didn't know yet, but I had a feeling. We agreed on the steps. I would not return to the house. I would not sign anything she put in front of me. I would let the lawyers speak to each other from here on, and I would attend, 2 days later, the reading of her father's will at the estate solicitor's office, because, and this was the second thing I'd kept in that binder, the thing I hadn't quite registered the weight of until my lawyer's face changed when she saw it. I was named in it. Her father, in the last year of his life, had asked me to drive him to his lawyer's office 3 times. I'd assumed he was tidying up. He didn't tell me what he was doing, and I didn't ask, because that wasn't our way. We'd sit in the car after, and he'd buy me a coffee, and we'd talk about the Leafs and the price of lumber, and never once about the appointment. What I learnt now, sitting in my own lawyer's office, was that he left me a copy of the executed will to hold, sealed, in case it's needed, he'd said, and I'd put it in the binder unopened and forgotten about it the way you forget a thing you were never told to remember. My lawyer opened it. She read it twice, and then she told me what her father had done. He had named his daughter and me as joint executors, both of us, neither able to act alone. And he had placed a rental fourplex, the little brick building in the East End with 4 tenants in it, the one that was now worth a great deal of money, not into his daughter's hands directly but into a trust, with instructions that the existing tenants, several of whom had lived there for 30 years, were not to be displaced, and that the property was not to be sold during the lifetime of the longest-standing tenant without the agreement of both executors. He'd written it himself in his own blunt words, and the lawyer had cleaned it up into legal language, but kept the bones. I remember one line my lawyer read out, paraphrasing, "The people in that building were good to my wife when she was sick, and I won't have them turned out by anyone, including my own blood." His wife, my mother-in-law, had spent the last 2 years of her life in that fourplex, in the ground floor unit, after a stroke, because it was easier to care for her there. The tenants had brought her soup, shoveled her step, sat with her so her husband could sleep. He had not forgotten. My wife, it turned out, had. So that was the shape of it, finally clear. My wife believed she had inherited a fortune outright and could use it to shove me out and cash in. What she had actually inherited was a structure built by a careful old man who loved his daughter but did not trust her judgment when money was involved, and he'd been right not to. The will reading itself was a quiet, terrible little piece of theater. I won't drag it out. I arrived early because I always arrive early. My father taught me that being on time is a way of respecting other people, and it's one of the few things of his I've kept whole. I sat in the waiting room with its grey carpet and its watercolor of a sailboat, and its smell of toner and old coffee, and at 10:20, my wife came in with her younger brother, who'd flown in from Calgary for the occasion, and a third person I didn't recognize at first, a man in an expensive coat with a leather folder, who turned out to be her real estate agent, brought along like a witness to a coronation. She saw me and stopped in the doorway. "What's he doing here?" she said to the room. The estate lawyer, a calm woman with reading glasses on a chain, answered before anyone else could. "He's a named executor. He's required to be present." My wife laughed, the same sharp laugh from the phone. "That's a mistake. He's nobody. He's not family by blood. He's named in the will," the lawyer said, in the flat tone of someone who has had this conversation 100 times and is not going to have it again. "Please, everyone sit." We sat. The agent in the expensive coat looked from face to face, and you could watch the afternoon he'd been promised begin to come apart behind his eyes. The lawyer read the will through section by section, the bungalow to be sold and split between the 2 children, the bank shares to my wife, a bequest to her brother, and then the fourplex, the trust, the protected tenants, the 2 executor lock, and finally the clause about the matrimonial home and inheritance that my own lawyer had flagged, written in by an old man who'd watched too many families tear themselves apart and wanted to slow the tearing down. My wife's face went through 3 weathers. First disbelief, then a kind of bargaining. She started to say, "We can simplify this. We can move faster. I'm the daughter." And then, when the lawyer kept her voice level and kept reading, something colder and more frightened settled in, because somewhere in the middle of it she remembered the deposit. I knew about the deposit by then. My lawyer had heard from the cottage buyer's lawyer that morning before I'd even left the motel. My wife had listed the cottage 2 weeks earlier, before her father was even called, before the estate had cleared, before she'd called me, and she'd accepted a cash deposit of $60,000 from a buyer who wanted a quick closing before the winter. She'd signed an agreement of purchase and sale as if the cottage were hers to sell. It wasn't. It was half mine, registered on title, and there is no version of the law in this country where you can sell a property out from under a joint tenant who hasn't signed. She'd taken $60,000 of a stranger's money for something she did not own. The agent in the expensive coat cleared his throat in that meeting and said, carefully, that perhaps there'd been a misunderstanding about the listing. My wife told him to be quiet. He did not stay quiet. He'd already heard from the buyer, who'd already heard from a lawyer, who had already used the word fraud, and a real estate agent's whole career rests on not being anywhere near that word. So he was busy in his own head saving himself, and you could see it. The meeting ended without anybody shaking hands. I checked the clock on the wall on my way out, 11:15, and I held that moment in my mind, the way you press a leaf in a book, because I knew I'd want it later, the exact minute everything she built turned to sand. What followed over the next few weeks was not dramatic. That's the part nobody tells you. The collapse of a scheme like hers doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with a series of small, dull, irreversible letters. The cottage sale died. It had to. My lawyer wrote to the buyer's lawyer confirming I would never sign, and the buyer, furious, demanded his $60,000 back. My wife had already spent some of it. On what? I never learned exactly. A new car lease and a trip she'd booked for after the divorce, I think, and so she could not return it cleanly, and the buyer sued. Not me. Me, he left alone, once he understood I'd had nothing to do with the listing. He sued her, and he had every right to. The bank, or rather the credit union where her father had banked for 50 years, had a line of credit she'd quietly drawn against in the days after his death, on the strength of an inheritance she'd assumed would land in her account whole and immediate. When the estate turned out to be tied up in a trust and an executor structure and a probate process that moves at its own glacial pace, that money didn't arrive on her schedule. The line got called. She had to scramble, and the rental fourplex. The prize, the building she'd already told the agent she wanted to empty and flip, stayed exactly as it was. The tenant stayed. I made sure of that. As joint executor, I had a say, and I used it, the only time in the whole affair that I went out of my way to do something rather than simply refuse to be moved. I drove out to the East End on a cold Saturday and knocked on the ground floor door, the unit where my mother-in-law had lived her last 2 years. A woman opened it, older than me, small, with her cardigan buttoned to the throat. She'd had a letter, she said, weeks ago before any of this, an informal note from my wife saying changes were coming, and she should start thinking about her options. She'd been sick with worry ever since. She was 81. She'd lived in that unit since 1979. She didn't know where on earth she'd go. I told her she wasn't going anywhere. I told her about the trust in plain words and what her father, I caught myself, my father-in-law, had written about her and the others, and how the building couldn't be sold while she lived there, and that I would personally see the rent stayed reasonable and the furnace got fixed before Christmas, which it did. She didn't cry. She just put her hand flat on the doorframe for a second, like she needed it to hold her up. And then she asked me if I'd like a tea, and I said yes, and I sat in that small, warm kitchen for an hour and let her tell me about the soup she used to bring upstairs. And it was the best hour I'd had in months. The divorce went ahead. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not going to pretend there was a reconciliation. There wasn't, and I didn't want one. A woman who would phone her husband of 38 years and tell him to clear out by the weekend, who would try to sell the lake out from under her own grandchildren before her father was buried, is not a woman you go back to. But it went ahead on lawful terms, slow and proper, with both of us represented, with the family property divided, the way the law divides it, which once her inheritance was found to have been poured into the house, and once the matrimonial home protections were counted, looked nothing like the clean sweep she'd promised herself on that bright, hard phone call. She did not walk away with millions and a free conscience. She walked away with her half of a divided estate, a lawsuit from a furious cottage buyer, a credit union that no longer trusted her, an agent who wouldn't return her calls, and the brother in Calgary who, when he understood what she'd tried to do with their father's wishes, stopped speaking to her entirely. I got the cottage, we sold the city house and split it, and I took my share and the cottage and the dog, and I moved up north for good. I'm writing this from the screened porch, as a matter of fact, though it's too cold to sit out here much longer this year. The lake's starting to skin over at the edges in the mornings. There was one last exchange between us. Months after, when the dust had mostly settled and the lawyers had done their work, I got a message from her number. I'd half expected an apology and half expected venom, and it turned out to be neither. It was 3 words. Hope you're happy. No punctuation. The way she texted when she was being cruel and wanted you to feel the flatness of it. I sat with the phone in my hand on this porch and I thought about all the things I could say. The years. The kitchen we'd argued over. Her mother's soup going cold upstairs while she made her plans. I thought about her father in the car after his lawyer's appointments, buying me a coffee and never once telling me what he'd done, trusting that a quiet man would do the quiet thing when the time came. And then I typed back 2 words and I meant them in a way she would never understand, because to her the words were a wish and to me they were a fact. I'm fine. Then I blocked the number and I put the phone face down on the little wooden table out here, and I let the afternoon go quiet around me. I'm 63 years old. I spent my whole working life adding up other people's numbers and making sure the math held, and I'll tell you the one thing all those years taught me that I wish somebody had told me sooner. When a person tries to overwhelm you, with money, with noise, with a deadline they invented, with the absolute certainty that they've already won, the worst thing you can do is hurry. Hurrying is what they're counting on. The panic is the whole plan. They want you scared and signing. So don't. Slow down. Keep the paper. Keep the record. Let the people who shout do their shouting, and let the law and the time and the quiet do the rest, because they will, more reliably than any anger you could muster. Her father knew that. He didn't leave me a fortune. He left me something better. He left me proof that being patient and being kept honest by what's written down will outlast almost anyone's hurry. The lake's nearly still now. There's a loon out there somewhere. I can hear it, but I can't see it. My tea's gone cold again, the way it always does when I get to thinking. I'm going to go in and put another log on the stove and let the old man's careful work keep the people in that East End building warm through one more winter, and call it a good enough ending. It is one. I built it the slow way, and the slow way holds.